The fog rolls thick over Marrow Ridge, clinging to the hollow like something alive, something that remembers. In the pre-dawn darkness of October 1902, a midwife named Constance Everill walks alone down a dirt path that winds between skeletal trees, her lantern casting shadows that seem to move independently of her steps. She has been summoned to the Holcomb farmstead, a collection of weathered structures nestled so deep in the Appalachian folds that even the sun struggles to find it by noon. Constance has delivered hundreds of children across these mountains, her hands steady, her prayers whispered low. But tonight, as she approaches the farmhouse where lamplight flickers behind oilcloth windows, she feels something she has never felt before. Not fear exactly, something older, something that sits in the marrow of the bones and whispers that what waits inside that house should not be seen by human eyes. The screaming has stopped. That is what frightens her most. Inside, a woman lies in blood-stained sheets, her breathing shallow, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as if watching something move across the rafters. And in the corner, wrapped in a quilt that bears the stains of birth, something small makes a sound that is not quite crying. Constance will leave this house before sunrise. She will return to her own cabin, lock the door, and never speak the details of this night to anyone. But the people of Marrow Ridge will know. They always know. Because in these mountains, secrets do not stay buried. They grow roots. They spread. And by 1902, the Holcomb family has been keeping a secret for 3 generations that is about to reveal itself in ways no one can explain, no one can stop, and no one will ever forget. Welcome to this channel. Today, we step into a case that is not just difficult to understand, it reshapes the meaning of fear itself. Like the video, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Marrow Ridge sits in the western mountains of Virginia, a region so isolated that when the census takers arrived in 1900, they recorded only 14 families living within a 12-mile radius. The terrain is unforgiving, carved by ancient rivers into steep valleys and narrow hollers where sunlight arrives late and leaves early. The soil is poor. The winters are brutal. And the families who settled here in the decades following the Civil War were people who had reasons to seek isolation, people who carried their own darkness into these hills and let it take root in the silence. The Holcomb family was among the first to claim land on Marrow Ridge. Jeremiah Holcomb arrived in 1867 with his wife, Marrow, and their 3 young children. They built a cabin from chestnut logs, cleared a small plot for corn and beans, and survived the first winter by trapping and trading with the few neighbors scattered across the surrounding ridges. Jeremiah was a quiet man, described in one surviving letter as having eyes that never quite met yours, as if he was always looking at something just beyond your shoulder. Marrow bore him 7 more children over the next 15 years. Of those 7, only 4 survived past the age of 5. This was not unusual for the time. Infant mortality in rural Appalachia was staggering. Scarlet fever, typhoid, accidents, malnutrition. Death was a constant presence in these households, accepted with grim resignation. But the deaths in the Holcomb family were different. Neighbors spoke in hushed voices about the strange illnesses that took the children, afflictions that seemed to twist their small bodies in unnatural ways before claiming them. One child, according to a letter written by a traveling preacher who passed through in 1879, was born with bones so soft they could not support the weight of the infant's own flesh. Another lived for 3 years but never grew teeth, never learned to walk, and made sounds that the preacher described as unlike any human voice he had ever heard. These details were not recorded in official documents. They were whispered at church gatherings, scribbled in private journals, passed down through generations as cautionary tales. And they were attributed, as so many things were in that time and place, to the will of God, to bad luck, to the harshness of mountain life. But by 1890, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. Jeremiah Holcomb died in 1885, crushed beneath a falling tree while clearing timber. Marrow followed him 2 years later, her body simply giving out after decades of childbearing and hardship. Their surviving children, now adults, remained on Marrow Ridge. The eldest son, Caleb, took over the family homestead. He married a woman named Lenora, whose origins remain unclear in the historical record. Some accounts suggest she was from a neighboring family, the Kittrells, who lived 2 ridges over. Other sources hint that Lenora may have been a distant cousin, a connection that would not have been unusual in such an isolated community. Caleb and Lenora had 6 children between 1888 and 1898, and it was with this generation that the true horror of Marrow Ridge began to manifest in ways that could not be explained away by poor diet or harsh conditions. The first child, a son named Abel, appeared healthy at birth, but by his 2nd year his development had slowed dramatically. He did not walk until he was 4. He spoke in fragments, never forming complete sentences. His head, according to a letter written by a visiting missionary in 1893, was unusually small, and his eyes had a peculiar flatness, as if the light did not quite reach them. The second child, a daughter named Mercy, was born with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. This alone was not unprecedented, a genetic anomaly that occurred occasionally in isolated populations. But Mercy's additional digits were not the malformed stumps sometimes seen in polydactyly. They were fully formed, fully functional, and according to one account, disturbingly symmetrical, as if they belonged there, as if this was how human hands were meant to be. The third child died within hours of birth, the body wrapped and buried so quickly that no one outside the immediate family ever saw it. The fourth child, a son named Josiah, lived to age 7. He was, by all accounts, a beautiful child with golden hair and delicate features, but Josiah never grew. By the time of his death in 1901, he stood no taller than a 3-year-old, his body perfectly proportioned but frozen in a state of perpetual childhood. The 5th child, another daughter, was stillborn, and the 6th child, born in October of 1898, was a boy named Ephraim, whose birth was attended by Constance Everill, and who she later described in a private letter as the most perfect infant I have ever delivered, which made what came after all the more unbearable. By 1900, rumors about the Holcomb family had spread throughout the region. At the general store in the nearest town, a place called Coopersville some 8 miles from Marrow Ridge, people spoke in low voices about the strange children being born in the hollers. A storekeeper named Dutch Brennan kept a ledger where he recorded not just transactions, but also gossip, observations, fragments of conversations. In an entry dated March 1901, he wrote, "Caleb Holcomb came in for supplies today, his eyes red like he had not slept in weeks. He bought twice the usual amount of lamp oil. I asked if everything was well at home. He did not answer, just paid and left. His hands were shaking. Other families on Marrow Ridge were also experiencing strange births. The Kittrell family, the Strouds, the Hensleys, all reported children born with deformities, developmental delays, and inexplicable illnesses. But it was the Holcomb family that bore the worst of it, and it was the Holcomb family that the community began to watch with a mixture of pity and fear. In the summer of 1901, a doctor named Samuel Pritchard traveled to Marrow Ridge at the request of a local minister who had grown concerned about the health of the families living there. Dr. Pritchard was a graduate of the Medical College of Virginia, a man of science who approached rural medicine with a combination of compassion and pragmatism. He spent 3 days on Marrow Ridge, visiting homes, examining children, taking notes. His journal from this visit still exists, housed in the archives of the Virginia Historical Society. The entries are clinical, detailed, and increasingly disturbing. July 14, 1901, visited the Holcomb homestead, examined 3 children. The eldest, Abel, age 13, displays significant cognitive impairment and physical underdevelopment. The second, Mercy, age 11, is of normal intelligence but exhibits polydactyly and pronounced facial asymmetry. The youngest, Ephraim, age 2, appears healthy but demonstrates an unusual sensitivity to light and sound, becoming agitated to the point of violence when exposed to either. July 15, 1901, examined children from the Kittrell and Stroud families. Similar patterns observed. developmental delays, physical abnormalities, and in one case, a 7-year-old girl who has never spoken and shows no response to external stimuli. The parents are loving and attentive, but there is a palpable sense of despair in these households. July 16, 1901. Spent the day reviewing my notes and attempting to identify a common cause for the conditions I have observed. Malnutrition and lack of medical care certainly contribute, but they do not explain the specific nature or prevalence of these abnormalities. I asked Caleb Holcomb if there had been any history of similar conditions in previous generations. He became defensive, almost hostile, and insisted that his children were no different from any others in these mountains. When I pressed, he ordered me to leave his property. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Dr. Pritchard returned to Coopersville with his notes and his concerns, but he took no further action. In a letter to a colleague dated August 1901, he wrote, "I have seen conditions in these mountains that defy my understanding. I suspect there are factors at play, environmental or hereditary, that are beyond my ability to address. These people are isolated, both geographically and socially, and they do not welcome outside interference. I fear that whatever is happening on Marrow Ridge will continue, and there is little I or anyone else can do to stop it." He was right. In October 1902, Lenora Holcomb went into labor with her 7th child. The birth was difficult, prolonged, and by the time Constance Everill arrived, Lenora had been laboring for nearly 2 days. The baby, when it finally came, was alive, but something was wrong. Constance's account of this birth exists in a letter she wrote to her sister, a letter that was discovered in an estate sale in 1967 and later donated to a regional archive. The letter is written in a shaking hand, the ink blotted in places as if the writer had paused frequently, struggling to continue. "My dearest Sarah, I write to you now because I must tell someone, and I cannot speak of this aloud. 2 nights ago, I was called to the Holcomb place for a birth. I have attended Lenora before, and though her labors are hard, they have always ended with a living child, strange as some of them are. But this time, Sarah, this time I wish I had refused. The child was born just before dawn, a boy, small but breathing. I cleaned him and wrapped him in a quilt, and it was only when I handed him to Lenora that I saw her face, not relief, not joy, but something close to horror. She held the baby at arm's length, staring at him as if he were something unclean. Caleb stood in the corner, his face pale, and he would not come near. I asked what was wrong. Lenora said nothing, but she pulled back the quilt and showed me. Sarah, the child had no eyes, not closed eyelids, not sunken sockets, but smooth skin where the eyes should have been, as if God had simply forgotten to place them. And yet the child turned his head toward sounds, toward voices, as if he could see us somehow. I have delivered children with defects before. Cleft palates, club feet, twisted limbs. But this, Sarah, this was different. This felt like a curse. I left before the sun rose. I did not ask to be paid. I do not want to return to that house. I do not know what is happening on Marrow Ridge, but I know that it is not natural. Pray for me, sister. Pray for all of us." The child was named Abner. He lived for 3 months, cared for by Lenora with a tenderness that some neighbors found heartbreaking and others found disturbing. Abner never cried. He made small, mewling sounds like a kitten, and he moved his head constantly, as if searching for something he could not find. In January 1903, Abner developed a fever and died within 2 days. He was buried in the small family cemetery behind the Holcomb homestead, joining his unnamed siblings in the hard mountain soil. But Abner's birth had consequences that rippled far beyond his brief life. Word of the eyeless child spread through the region like wildfire. At church gatherings, at the general store, at barn raisings and quilting bees, people spoke of the Holcomb baby in hushed, horrified tones, and they began to ask questions that had been whispered for years but never spoken aloud. Why were so many children on Marrow Ridge being born with defects? Why did the abnormalities seem to be getting worse with each generation? And what, exactly, was the relationship between the families living on that ridge? In February 1903, A traveling preacher named Reverend Thomas Colby arrived in Coopersville. Reverend Colby was not a local man. He was from Pennsylvania, part of a missionary effort to bring education and moral guidance to isolated mountain communities. He was idealistic, earnest, and utterly unprepared for what he would find on Marrow Ridge. Reverend Colby spent several weeks visiting families in the area, holding prayer meetings, teaching children to read, and listening to the concerns of the community. And everywhere he went, he heard stories about the Holcomb family. In a sermon delivered in March 1903, recorded in a local church's records, Reverend Colby addressed the issue directly. He spoke of the sins of the fathers being visited upon the children, of the consequences of isolating oneself from the broader community, and of the dangers of, and here the record uses a phrase that would have been understood by his audience without further explanation, keeping too close to one's own blood. It was not a new concept. Inbreeding, the practice of marrying within a small, isolated group, often within the same family, had long been understood to cause problems. European royalty had suffered from it for centuries, producing hemophilia, mental instability, and physical deformities. But in rural Appalachia, where families were often separated by miles of rough terrain, and where suspicion of outsiders ran deep, the practice was more common than most people wanted to admit. On Marrow Ridge, the isolation was extreme. The 14 families recorded in the 1900 census were not just neighbors. They were related, interconnected through decades of marriages that tied them together in a web of blood relations so complex that untangling it would require knowledge that most of them did not have or did not want to acknowledge. Caleb Holcomb's wife, Lenora, was indeed a Kittrell. But the Kittrells were already related to the Holcombs through Caleb's mother, Marybeth, whose maiden name was also Kittrell. The Strouds had married into the Hensleys, who had married back into the Holcombs. The same surnames appeared again and again in the genealogical records, looping back on themselves in patterns that geneticists would later recognize as a classic example of a founder effect, a population bottleneck where a small group reproduces in isolation until the gene pool becomes dangerously shallow. But in 1903, genetics was a new science, barely understood outside of academic circles. The work of Gregor Mendel, the Moravian monk whose experiments with pea plants had laid the foundation for modern genetics, had been published decades earlier but remained largely unknown. The concept of recessive genes, of inherited traits that could skip generations and then manifest with devastating consequences, was not part of the common understanding. The people of Marrow Ridge did not have the language to describe what was happening to them. They only knew that something was deeply, terribly wrong. Reverend Colby, armed with his missionary zeal and his limited understanding, decided to investigate. He began visiting families, asking questions about lineage, about marriages, about children. And the more he learned, the more horrified he became. In a letter to his mission board dated April 1903, he wrote, "I have uncovered a situation of such moral and physical degradation that I scarcely know how to proceed. The families living on Marrow Ridge have been intermarrying for generations, often within the same bloodlines, and the results are evident in the children. I have seen deformities that I cannot adequately describe, conditions that seem to worsen with each successive generation. I have tried to counsel these families, to explain the dangers of their practices, but they are resistant, defensive, and in some cases, hostile to any suggestion that they have done wrong. They see themselves as victims of circumstance, not as participants in their own tragedy. I fear that without intervention, this situation will only continue to deteriorate." The intervention that Reverend Colby hoped for never came. His letters to the mission board went unanswered. The state government, focused on industrialization and the growth of cities, had little interest in the problems of a handful of isolated mountain families. And the people of Marrow Ridge, faced with the preacher's accusations and his prying questions, turned inward, closing ranks against the outside world. In June 1903, Reverend Colby made one final visit to the Holcomb homestead. He went alone, on foot, carrying his Bible and his notes. What happened during that visit is not entirely clear. Accounts vary. Some say that Caleb Holcomb, already under immense strain from the loss of his children and the weight of community judgment, became enraged and threatened the Reverend with violence. Others suggest that the confrontation was quieter, sadder, a conversation between two men who could not bridge the gulf between their worldviews. What is certain is that Reverend Colby left Marrow Ridge that day and never returned. In a final letter to a colleague, dated June 15, 1903, he wrote, "I have done all I can. These people are beyond help not because they are wicked but because they are trapped by geography, by poverty, by tradition, and by their own refusal to see the truth of their situation. I wash my hands of Marrow Ridge. May God have mercy on them." Within a month, Reverend Colby had left Virginia entirely, returning to Pennsylvania. He never spoke publicly about his time on Marrow Ridge, but his letters, his notes, and his sermon remain preserved in archives, offering a glimpse into a community on the edge of collapse. And the collapse, when it came, was both inevitable and devastating. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? In the fall of 1903, a series of events began that would bring Marrow Ridge to the attention of authorities and, eventually, to the pages of regional newspapers. The first event was the death of Mercy Holcomb, the girl with 6 fingers on each hand. Mercy was 13 years old, intelligent despite her physical abnormalities, and by all accounts, deeply troubled. She had been kept out of school, partly because of her appearance and partly because the nearest schoolhouse was miles away and difficult to reach during the winter months. She spent her days helping her mother with chores, caring for her younger siblings, and according to one account, writing in a journal that no one else was allowed to see. In October 1903, Mercy disappeared. She left the homestead early one morning, telling her mother she was going to check the traplands for rabbits. When she did not return by nightfall, Caleb organized a search. Neighbors came to help, combing the ridges and hollers, calling her name into the darkness. They found her 3 days later at the bottom of a ravine, her body broken on the rocks below. The death was ruled an accident. The ravine was steep, the footing treacherous, and it was assumed that Mercy had simply lost her footing and fallen. But there were whispers. Dutch Brennan, the storekeeper, wrote in his ledger, "They say the girl jumped. They say she could not bear to look at herself anymore, could not bear the way people stared. They say she left a note, but Caleb burned it before anyone could read it." Whether Mercy's death was an accident or something else, it marked a turning point for the Holcomb family. Lenora, already fragile from years of difficult pregnancies and the loss of so many children, retreated into herself. She stopped attending church, stopped visiting neighbors, and spent her days sitting by the window, staring out at the mountains as if waiting for something. Caleb became harder, more isolated. He drank, a habit that was noted by several neighbors, and he became quick to anger, lashing out at anyone who came too close. And the children, the surviving children, were increasingly kept out of sight. Abel, the eldest, was now 15, a hulking figure with the mind of a much younger child. Ephraim, now 5, had grown into a strange, quiet boy who flinched at loud noises and avoided sunlight, spending his days in the dim interior of the cabin. It was around this time that another family on Marrow Ridge experienced a tragedy that would become inextricably linked with the Holcombs. The Kittrell family, already related to the Holcombs through marriage, had a daughter named Esther, age 16. Esther was considered one of the few normal children born on Marrow Ridge in recent years. She was healthy, attractive, and engaged to be married to a young man from Coopersville, a rare instance of a Marrow Ridge family connecting with the outside world. But in November 1903, Esther Kittrell gave birth to a child out of wedlock. The father, she claimed, was her fiancé, though he vehemently denied it and broke off the engagement immediately. The child, a girl, was born prematurely and lived only a few hours. But what shocked the community was not the circumstances of the birth, scandalous as they were, but the appearance of the infant. According to a letter written by the midwife who attended the birth, the child was born with features that were not quite human, a description that is frustratingly vague but suggests severe deformities. The midwife, a woman named Ida Proctor, later told her family that the baby had looked like something pulled from a nightmare, though she refused to elaborate further. Esther Kittrell, devastated by the loss of her child and the collapse of her engagement, accused her cousin, Nathaniel Kittrell, of being the father. Nathaniel denied it. The families, already tense from years of tragedy and suspicion, turned on each other. Accusations flew. Old grievances were dredged up. And in the midst of the chaos, a darker truth began to emerge. Esther had not named Nathaniel as the father initially. She had been pressured to do so by her own parents, who were desperate to deflect blame from another, unnamed relative, someone closer to home. The details of this accusation are murky, lost in a tangle of conflicting accounts and destroyed records. But the implication was clear. The web of relationships on Marrow Ridge had become so tangled, so incestuous, that even the families themselves could no longer untangle who was related to whom, or what lines had been crossed. In December 1903, the Kittrell family left Marrow Ridge. They sold their property for a fraction of its worth and moved to Coopersville, where they were met with suspicion and hostility. Esther never married. She died in 1921, at the age of 34, in a state asylum for the mentally ill. Her medical records, which still exist, note that she suffered from severe depression and paranoia, and that she spoke frequently of the child she had lost, claiming that it haunted her dreams, that she could hear it crying in the night. With the Kittrells gone, the remaining families on Marrow Ridge drew even closer together, bound by shared shame and shared suffering. The Holcombs, the Strouds, the Hensleys, they became a closed society, refusing to interact with outsiders, refusing to send their children to school, refusing medical care even when it was offered. And the births continued. In 1904, Lenora Holcomb became pregnant again. She was 38 years old, exhausted, and in poor health. The pregnancy was difficult from the start. She bled frequently, suffered from severe headaches, and spent much of her time in bed, too weak to care for her remaining children. Caleb, desperate, sent word to Coopersville asking for a doctor. Dr. Pritchard, who had visited Marrow Ridge years earlier, refused to come. He sent a terse reply stating that he could not in good conscience assist a family that refused to acknowledge the root of their problems. Instead, a younger doctor, a man named Lewis Hargrave, agreed to make the trip. Dr. Hargrave was fresh out of medical school, idealistic and eager to help. He arrived at the Holcomb homestead in August 1904, expecting to find a routine case of a difficult pregnancy. What he found was a house that felt, in his words, like the anteroom to hell. Dr. Hargrave's account of his visit to Marrow Ridge was published years later in a medical journal, though the names were changed to protect the identities of those involved. But the details are unmistakable, and the article, titled Hereditary Defects in an Isolated Mountain Population, caused a minor scandal when it was released, drawing both scientific interest and moral condemnation. In the article, Hargrave describes arriving at the Holcomb homestead and being struck immediately by the atmosphere of despair. The cabin was dark, filthy, and smelled of sickness. The children, 2 boys, were present but did not interact with him, instead watching from the corners of the room with what he described as feral wariness. Lenora was in bed, her face gray, her breathing labored. She was approximately 7 months pregnant. And Hargrave could see immediately that something was wrong. Her abdomen was misshapen, the swelling uneven, and when he palpated it, he could feel what seemed like multiple masses, hard and irregular. He suspected twins, possibly conjoined, or a tumor. He recommended that Lenora be taken to a hospital in the nearest city, a journey of more than 30 miles that would have required a wagon and several days of travel. Caleb refused. He did not trust hospitals, did not trust outsiders, and insisted that his wife would deliver at home as she always had. Hargrave argued, pleaded, explained the risks, but Caleb was immovable. The doctor left, frustrated and deeply concerned. He reported the situation to the county health board, but no action was taken. In late September 1904, Lenora went into labor. The labor lasted 4 days. No midwife would come. Constance Everill had left the region entirely, citing her age and declining health, though everyone knew the real reason. Ida Proctor, the midwife who had attended Esther Kittrell, refused, saying she would not set foot on Marrow Ridge again even if her own life depended on it. Lenora labored alone, attended only by Caleb and her 2 sons, neither of whom had any idea how to help. On the 4th day, the screaming stopped. Caleb sent Abel, the eldest, to fetch help, but by the time a neighbor arrived it was over. Lenora was dead. The child or children had died with her. Caleb, according to the neighbor's account, was sitting on the porch, covered in blood, staring at nothing. He would not speak. He would not explain what had happened. The neighbor entered the cabin and found Lenora's body still in the bed, the sheets soaked with blood. Wrapped in a quilt beside her was something that the neighbor later described as unnatural, wrong, a mass of flesh that might have been 1 child or 2, fused together in a way that made it impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. The neighbor fled. He reported what he had seen to the authorities, but it took 3 days for anyone to arrive. By then, Caleb had buried his wife and the infant, or infants, in the family cemetery. He refused to allow the bodies to be exhumed. He threatened violence against anyone who tried. The sheriff, a man named Carl Whitlock, decided not to press the issue. In his report, dated October 5, 1904, he wrote, "I have no desire to dig up bodies to satisfy morbid curiosity. The family has suffered enough. Let them grieve in peace." But peace did not come to Marrow Ridge. In the months following Lenora's death, the Holcomb homestead fell into ruin. Caleb stopped farming, stopped trapping, stopped caring for himself or his children. Neighbors, despite their own struggles, tried to help, bringing food, firewood, offering to take the boys, but Caleb refused all assistance. Abel and Ephraim were seen occasionally, wandering the ridge, silent and hollow-eyed like ghosts. In the spring of 1905, a fire broke out in the Holcomb cabin. The cause was never determined. Some said it was an accident, a knocked-over lantern, a neglected stove. Others whispered that Caleb had set it deliberately, that he could no longer bear the weight of his life and had chosen to end it. The cabin burned to the ground. Abel managed to escape, but Caleb and Ephraim did not. Their bodies were found in the ruins, charred beyond recognition. Abel, now 17 but with the mental capacity of a child, was taken in by the Stroud family, the only family on Marrow Ridge willing to care for him. He lived with them for 2 years, helping with chores, speaking rarely, and then in the winter of 1907 he walked out into a snowstorm and was never seen again. His body was never found. With the Holcombs gone, Marrow Ridge began to empty. The Hensleys left in 1906. The Strouds followed in 1908. By 1910, only 3 families remained, and by 1920 the ridge was abandoned entirely. The cabins, left to the elements, collapsed into rotting heaps of timber. The fields, once cleared with so much labor, were reclaimed by forest. The cemetery, with its crude wooden markers, was swallowed by underbrush. Marrow Ridge became a ghost, a name on old maps, a place that people avoided without quite knowing why. But the story did not end there. Because the consequences of what happened on Marrow Ridge extended far beyond the ridge itself. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? In 1921, a geneticist named Dr. Margaret Bellamy arrived in Virginia as part of a broader study on hereditary conditions in isolated populations. Dr. Bellamy was one of the few female geneticists of her era, a pioneering figure who had studied under some of the leading scientists of the time. She had read about Marrow Ridge in Dr. Hargrave's article and was intrigued by the descriptions of the abnormalities observed there. She wanted to study the genealogy of the families, to trace the inheritance patterns, to understand how such severe conditions could arise in such a concentrated way. But by the time she arrived, Marrow Ridge was deserted. The families had scattered, some moving to nearby towns, others disappearing into the broader population. Dr. Bellamy spent months tracking down survivors, interviewing them, collecting family histories. Many refused to speak with her. The shame of Marrow Ridge ran deep, and those who had lived there did not want to revisit it. But a few, mostly elderly individuals nearing the end of their lives, agreed to talk. From these interviews, Dr. Bellamy pieced together a genealogical chart that was, in her words, a genetic catastrophe. She found that the 14 families living on Marrow Ridge in 1900 were, in fact, descended from only 4 original couples who had settled in the area in the years immediately following the Civil War. Over the course of 3 generations, these families had intermarried so extensively that by the time of the tragedies in the early 1900s, the average coefficient of inbreeding, a measure of genetic relatedness, was equivalent to that of siblings. In some cases, it was higher. Dr. Bellamy's findings were published in a scientific journal in 1923. The article, titled Genetic Consequences of Inbreeding in an Isolated Appalachian Community, was met with a mix of scientific interest and moral outrage. Critics accused her of exploiting a vulnerable population, of dredging up painful history for academic gain. Supporters argued that her work was essential to understanding the dangers of genetic isolation and could help prevent similar tragedies in the future. But what Dr. Bellamy found most disturbing was not the inbreeding itself, though that was certainly the root cause of the abnormalities. It was the pattern of those abnormalities. The conditions she documented, polydactyly, microcephaly, dwarfism, congenital blindness, and others, were consistent with the expression of multiple recessive genes, genes that would have been carried silently through the population until individuals inherited 2 copies, one from each parent. In a normal, diverse population, these genes would be rare, and the chance of 2 carriers having a child together would be slim. But in a population as inbred as Marrow Ridge, the odds skyrocketed. Every generation, the genetic load, the accumulation of harmful mutations, increased, and with each successive generation, the severity of the conditions worsened, until the population reached a point where it could no longer sustain itself. But Dr. Bellamy also found something else, something that troubled her deeply, and that she mentioned only briefly in her published work. Several of the individuals she interviewed described children born on Marrow Ridge who did not fit the profile of typical genetic abnormalities. These were children who appeared normal at birth but developed strange behaviors as they aged, children who seemed to possess an intelligence that was both precocious and unsettling, children who, according to one interviewee, seemed to know things they should not know, to see things that were not there. One woman, a former resident of Marrow Ridge who had since moved to Coopersville, told Dr. Bellamy about a child born to the Stroud family in 1897. The child, a girl named Tabitha, was described as unnervingly beautiful, with pale skin, dark eyes, and an unnerving stillness. Tabitha rarely cried as an infant and rarely spoke as a child, but she would stare at people with an intensity that made them uncomfortable, and she had a habit of appearing in places where she should not have been, in rooms that had been empty moments before, standing at the edges of fields at dusk, watching. The woman claimed that Tabitha had predicted the death of her own mother, telling her calmly one morning that Mama will be gone before the snow comes. Her mother died 2 months later, in early November, of pneumonia. Tabitha herself disappeared in 1905, around the same time that the Holcombs died in the fire. She was 8 years old. Some said she had been taken in by relatives in another state. Others whispered that she had simply walked into the woods one day and never come back, that her footprints had been found leading to the edge of a cliff, but no body had ever been recovered. Dr. Bellamy did not know what to make of these stories. She was a scientist, trained to deal in facts, in measurable data. But she could not ignore the consistency of the accounts, the way so many people described similar phenomena, children who were different, not in the ways that genetics could explain, but in ways that felt, for lack of a better word, otherworldly. In her private notes, which were not discovered until after her death in 1968, Dr. Bellamy wrote, "I cannot shake the feeling that there is something more happening on Marrow Ridge than simple genetics can account for. The inbreeding is real, the genetic consequences are clear, but there is an element to these stories that suggests something else, something that science cannot yet explain. Perhaps it is simply the human tendency to mythologize tragedy, to find supernatural explanations for natural horrors. Or perhaps, in isolating themselves so completely, these families stumbled upon some threshold, some boundary between the normal and the abnormal, the human and the not quite human. I do not know, and I am not certain I want to know. Dr. Bellamy's work brought attention to the issue of genetic isolation in rural populations, and it contributed to broader efforts in the early 20th century to provide better health care and education to isolated communities. But Marrow Ridge itself remained forgotten, a footnote in academic papers, a cautionary tale told in hushed tones. Until 1935, when something happened that forced people to remember. In the summer of 1935, a family from Pennsylvania was traveling through Virginia on vacation. They were driving along a remote mountain road when their car broke down. The father, a man named Robert Kensington, walked to the nearest town to find help, leaving his wife and 2 children, a boy of 10 and a girl of 8 in the car. The town was Coopersville, and it took Robert several hours to arrange for a mechanic to come out and repair the car. By the time they returned, it was late afternoon. The car was where he had left it, parked on the side of the road. But his wife and children were gone. Robert panicked. He searched the area, calling their names, and eventually found them about a quarter-mile from the road, standing in what had once been a clearing but was now overgrown with saplings and brush. His wife Margaret was pale, shaking, and would not speak. His daughter Emily was crying. His son Thomas stood very still, staring at something in the trees. Robert demanded to know what had happened. It took Margaret several minutes to compose herself enough to explain. She said that while they were waiting, Emily had wandered off into the woods and Thomas had gone after her. Margaret had followed, and they had found themselves in a clearing where the ruins of old cabins stood, crumbling and vine-covered. And in the ruins, Margaret said, they had seen children. 4 or 5 of them, Thomas had said. They were standing in the shadows of the collapsed buildings, watching. They were dirty, their clothes in tatters, and they did not move or speak. Margaret called out, asking if they needed help, but the children did not respond. They simply stood there, staring. And then Emily screamed. She said that one of the children had smiled at her and that its teeth were wrong, too many, too sharp. Margaret grabbed her children and ran, and the strange children did not follow. They just stood there, watching, until Margaret and her family were back at the road. Robert did not believe the story. He thought his wife and children had been frightened by shadows, by their own imaginations, by the strangeness of being stranded in an unfamiliar place. But when the mechanic arrived and heard the story, his face went pale. He asked where they had been, and when Robert described the location, the mechanic said, "That is Marrow Ridge. No one goes there. No one has lived there in 20 years." The mechanic, a man named Bill Carver, told Robert the story of Marrow Ridge, or at least a version of it. He spoke of families who had lived there, families who had married each other, families whose children had been born wrong, families who had died or disappeared. He said that after the last families left, people had reported seeing lights on the ridge at night, hearing sounds, voices singing or crying, and seeing figures moving through the trees, figures that looked like children but were not quite right. Robert thought the mechanic was trying to scare them, indulging in local superstition. But Margaret refused to stay in the area any longer. She insisted they leave immediately, even though it was getting dark, even though the mechanic warned them that driving these mountain roads at night was dangerous. They left, and Robert never thought about Marrow Ridge again, until decades later, when his daughter Emily, now an adult, told him that she still dreamed about the children she had seen that day, that she could still see their faces, pale and hollow, and their smiles, wide and wrong. Emily's account, recorded in an interview conducted by a folklorist in the 1970s, is one of the few first-hand descriptions of Marrow Ridge in the years after its abandonment. And it is not the only one. Between 1935 and 1960, several other reports surfaced of hikers, hunters, and travelers encountering strange phenomena on or near Marrow Ridge. A hunter in 1942 reported finding a small structure, like a lean-to, built from branches and filled with bones, animal bones he hoped, arranged in patterns that seemed deliberate. A group of teenagers in 1953, exploring the area on a dare, claimed they heard singing, a high, childlike voice coming from the ruins of one of the cabins, and when they approached, they saw a figure, small and pale, standing in the doorway, watching them until they ran. A forestry worker in 1958 reported finding footprints, small bare footprints, leading from the ruins up to a cliff edge, where they simply stopped, as if whoever had made them had stepped off into the air. These stories are impossible to verify. They exist as fragments, anecdotes, whispered tales passed from person to person. But they persist, woven into the folklore of the region, a mythology built on the bones of a very real tragedy. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? In 1974, a team of anthropologists and historians from a university conducted a survey of abandoned settlements in Appalachia, and Marrow Ridge was included in their study. The team spent 3 days on the ridge, documenting the ruins, collecting artifacts, and conducting interviews with elderly residents of Coopersville who remembered the families who had lived there. Their report, filed in the university archives, is a dry academic document, but it includes several details that are chilling in their implications. The team found the remains of 7 structures, all in advanced states of decay. They found the cemetery, though many of the wooden markers had rotted away, leaving only a few legible names. Jeremiah Holcomb, 1867 to 1885. Mercy Holcomb, 1890 to 1903. Abner Holcomb, 1902 to 1903. They also found evidence of more recent activity. Campfire rings, though they could not date them. Footprints in the soft earth near one of the cabins, small footprints, child-sized. And most disturbingly, a collection of objects arranged in a circle in what had been the main room of the largest cabin. The objects included bones, stones, pieces of rusted metal, and scraps of fabric, all placed with what the report described as deliberate care, suggesting intentionality. The team did not speculate on who might have placed the objects or why, but they noted that the arrangement did not appear to be old. The fabric scraps were relatively intact. The bones had not yet been weathered by exposure. One member of the team, a graduate student named Laura Chen, included a personal note in her section of the report. She wrote, "I do not know what to make of what we found on Marrow Ridge. The history is tragic, the genetics are clear, but there is something about the place that feels wrong, not just sad, but wrong. On our last night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside the tent. I assumed it was one of my colleagues, but when I checked, everyone was asleep. I lay there listening, and the footsteps circled the tent slowly, deliberately, and then stopped. I did not sleep the rest of the night. I was glad to leave. The report was filed and forgotten, but Laura Chen never forgot. In an interview conducted in 2005, she said, "I have spent my career studying abandoned communities, forgotten places, and I have never felt the way I felt on Marrow Ridge. It is hard to explain. It felt like the place was watching us, like it did not want us there. I do not believe in ghosts. I believe in history, in sociology, in the material conditions that shape human lives." But Marrow Ridge challenged that belief. So what really happened on Marrow Ridge? The answer, in one sense, is straightforward. A group of families, isolated by geography and circumstance, intermarried to the point where their gene pool became dangerously shallow, leading to the expression of recessive genetic disorders that caused severe physical and cognitive abnormalities. The tragedy was compounded by poverty, lack of medical care, and a cultural reluctance to acknowledge or address the problem. This is the explanation that science provides, and it is an explanation supported by evidence. Dr. Bellamy's research, the medical reports, the genealogical records, all point to inbreeding as the root cause of the suffering on Marrow Ridge. But science does not explain everything. It does not explain the stories of children who seemed to know things they should not, who appeared in places they could not have reached, who smiled with too many teeth. It does not explain the lights seen on the ridge decades after it was abandoned, or the voices heard singing in the ruins. It does not explain the footprints, the arranged objects, the feeling of wrongness that so many people described. Perhaps these are simply the products of human imagination, the way we mythologize tragedy, the way we create ghost stories to make sense of horrors that are too mundane, too cruel, to accept at face value. Or perhaps, in the process of collapsing their gene pool, in the process of turning inward so completely, the families of Marrow Ridge crossed some invisible line, some threshold where the human became something else, something that should not exist but does, lingering in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. There is one more piece to this story, one final detail that has never been fully explained. In 2003, exactly 100 years after the death of Mercy Holcomb, a hiker named David Torres was exploring the area around Marrow Ridge. He was an experienced outdoorsman, familiar with the region, and he knew the stories. He did not believe them, but he was curious. He hiked to the site of the old Holcomb homestead, now nothing more than a depression in the ground and a few rotted timbers. And there, in the center of what had been the cabin, he found something that should not have been there. A doll, handmade from cloth and straw, dressed in a tiny dress that was old but not ancient. And beside the doll, scratched into the dirt, were words, "We are still here." David took a photograph of the words and the doll, and then he left. He posted the photograph online, in a forum dedicated to Appalachian folklore, and it caused a minor stir. Some people dismissed it as a hoax, a staged scene meant to perpetuate the myth of Marrow Ridge. Others suggested that it was the work of vandals, teenagers playing a prank. But a few people who had studied the history, people who had visited Marrow Ridge themselves, looked at the photograph and felt a chill. Because the handwriting, if it could be called that, was crude, uneven, the letters formed with difficulty, as if by someone who had never been taught to write properly. And the doll, though clearly old, showed signs of recent handling. The fabric was frayed but not rotted. The straw stuffing was compressed but not disintegrated. David Torres never returned to Marrow Ridge. In an interview, he said, "I do not know what I found. I do not know if it was real or if someone was messing with me. But I know that I felt something when I was there, something that made me want to leave and never come back. And I know that I have dreams sometimes, dreams where I am back at that homestead, and there are children watching me from the trees, and I cannot move, I cannot run. I can only stand there while they watch, and they smile, and they wait." The story of Marrow Ridge is a story of many things. It is a story of poverty, of isolation, of the ways that geography and culture can trap people in cycles of suffering. It is a story of genetics, of the cold, impersonal mathematics of heredity, of the way that nature punishes populations that collapse inward on themselves. It is a story of shame, of the way that communities hide their tragedies, bury their secrets, and let the silence grow until it swallows everything. But it is also a story that resists easy explanations, a story that lingers in the mind, that whispers questions that have no answers. Were the children of Marrow Ridge simply victims of genetic misfortune, or did something else happen on that ridge, something that science cannot explain? Are the reports of strange sightings and eerie phenomena simply the product of folklore and imagination, or is there something still lingering in those woods, something that was born from the tragedy and refuses to die? We may never know. The families are gone. The ridge is empty. The records are fragmentary, the memories fading. All that remains are the stories passed down, reshaped, growing more distorted with each retelling. And in those stories, in the whispers and the rumors and the late-night tales told around campfires, Marrow Ridge lives on, a place where the line between the real and the unreal blurs, where the consequences of human choices echo across generations, and where, if you listen closely on a quiet night, you might still hear the voices of children singing songs that no one taught them, calling out from the darkness, waiting for someone to answer. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And so we return to where we began, to that October night in 1902, to Constance Everill walking through the fog toward the Holcomb homestead, to the moment when the tragedy of Marrow Ridge became impossible to ignore. But now we know what Constance did not, that the birth she was about to attend was not an isolated event, but the culmination of decades of choices, of isolation, of blood binding to blood until the line between family and fate became indistinguishable. We know that the eyeless child she delivered would live only 3 months, but that the horror he represented would endure far longer. We know that the families of Marrow Ridge, in their desperate attempt to survive in an unforgiving landscape, created a legacy of suffering that would outlast them all. But we also know something else, something that the records cannot tell us, something that exists only in the stories and the whispers and the uneasy feeling that settles over those woods even now. We know that Marrow Ridge has never truly been abandoned, that something remains there, something born from the confluence of tragedy and isolation, of genetic collapse and human despair. Whether it is the literal ghosts of the children who died there or something more abstract, the weight of accumulated suffering, the echo of lives cut short, the memory of a community that destroyed itself, we cannot say. But it is there, in the ruins and the trees, in the silence that is never quite silent, in the darkness that seems to watch, to wait, to remember. And perhaps that is the true horror of Marrow Ridge, not the genetic abnormalities, not the inbreeding, not even the deaths, tragic as they were. The true horror is the way that tragedy transforms a place, the way it seeps into the soil and the stones and the air itself, until the place becomes a monument to suffering, a scar on the landscape that will never fully heal. The families of Marrow Ridge are gone, but Marrow Ridge remains, waiting in the mountains, holding its secrets close, and perhaps, just perhaps, still home to something that should have died long ago but did not, something that lingers in the spaces between what was and what should never have been, something that whispers even now to those who dare to listen. We are still here.